on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand, and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at his right hand, "Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and we visited you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to the least of these, who are members of my family, you did it to me." Then he will say to those at his left hand, "You are accursed. Depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not give me clothing, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they also will answer, "Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and we did not take care of you?" Then he will answer them, "Truly, I tell you, just as you did not do to the least of these, you did not do it to me." And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. There's always something puzzling about these parables. Some detail that is so far out there, it just doesn't make sense. Something that would have gotten those first century hearers scratching their heads. These past few weeks, we've been working our way through these parables in Matthew, hearing these stories with bizarre twists in them. If you'll recall the vineyard owner who went out on his own to hire laborers rather than sending his manager. And then at the end of the day, he paid everyone the same amount regardless of how long they worked. Then there was that rough story about the king who slaughtered a whole city just because they didn't want to go to his party. These parables are puzzling. Well, this week we find ourselves with the sheep and the goats. Only this time there isn't an obvious, bizarre element to the story. At face value, those who had initially heard this, it would have made sense to them. Having it set up as a final judgment tale, that would have been fine. At the time, many people in Israel believed there would come a judgment day when God would set things right, when God would hold the people morally accountable and judge them accordingly. This talk about righting wrongs and sorting everyone as God sees fit would not have been out of the ordinary. No puzzlement there. This implication that the shepherd was the one to make the final judgment wouldn't have been heard as strange either. Throughout the Old Testament, there are images of God as a shepherd. Psalm 23 comes to mind, for example. So this imagery wouldn't have caused puzzlement. And this idea of separating the sheep from the goats would not have been odd at all, at least for those familiar with shepherding practices in Palestine at the time. Because when it came time for a shepherd to turn in for the night, they would separate the sheep from the goats. The sheep could handle being out in the open pasture, but the goats needed more protection from the cold. Separating them was common practice. There was nothing really strange about that. And then there's this whole placing a different value on the sheep versus the goats. That wouldn't have been strange either. Everyone at the time knew sheep were worth more. They had more commercial value. They were the preferred animal. So it wouldn't be odd that this parable places them in that righteous position on the right-hand side. Then there's that part where Jesus is talking about those who took care of their neighbors, pointing out that some responded to the needs, but others just walked on by. That wouldn't have been surprising at all. It's common knowledge that there are those in this world who respond to those in need and others who choose to ignore them. Do y'all know that show, What Would You Do? It's the show where they set up a hidden camera and create these scenarios where people have to decide how to respond. They don't know that they're on a show, but they're in this position where they see a waitress being harassed by somebody, or an intoxicated valet trying to park cars, and the unknowing contestants, have to decide, am I going to speak up, or am I just going to ignore what's going on over there? Well, as you see in the show, far too often people just ignore what's going on. It seems to point to this bigger reality that we just want to mind our own business, right? We don't want to get involved. It's our human nature. Perhaps if those folks knew they were on hidden camera, they might be more willing to speak up. Much like these goats might be more willing to help if they knew it was God all along. But all of this talk about doing right and wrong wouldn't have been strange for the people to hear. Jesus talked about that a lot. It's not too different than the parable of the Good Samaritan. So where is the puzzling element in this parable? Where is the part of the story that would have caused the hearers to go, huh? Jesus, what are you talking about? Perhaps we struggle with this parable because we are too busy locating ourselves in the story. Are we the sheep or are we the goats? And what does that mean for Judgment Day and our individual fate being sealed for eternity? I recall wrestling with this question as a freshman in high school. At the time, the Left Behind book series was very popular, and Kirk Cameron had just starred in the film adaptation. Now I'm just going to pause for a moment here, especially with our confirmation students present, and make the disclaimer that if Kirk Cameron is involved in a project, it's probably not going to be very Presbyterian. His theology is different, we'll put it that way. But my Presbyterian youth group didn't care about that. We were super interested in this film. It got us talking about all sorts of things. Our interest in the book of Revelations flared up. And so we spent several weeks watching clips of this film, engaging in serious dialogue about eternal matters, talking about heaven and hell and where we might end up. Through the course of this conversation, this parable about the sheep and the goats came up. It's the only place in the New Testament where we see that phrase, final judgment, the only one. So we took very seriously this call to be sheep or goats. But honestly, we didn't really keep reading past that part where the shepherd or the king congratulates the sheep for being righteous. We sort of just stopped there. We didn't keep reading to that whole part that comes next. We just stopped and sort of patted ourselves on the back, congratulated ourselves for being the ones to go to church, to read the Bible. We figured, well, that's got to make us sheep, right? We were certain that we were sheep, that we would not be left behind by poor Kirk Cameron in that film. But the trouble is, we didn't keep reading. We didn't keep reading to that part where there's this talk about caring for the least of these. We were so caught up in locating ourselves, figuring out which character we were, that we didn't hear the rest of the story. Because the truth is, if we read on, we see this startling statement, not so much about ourselves, but about God, and where God is located in this story. Pastor John Buchanan speaks to this when he says, the God of Jesus, the God of the Bible, is not a remote, supreme being up on a throne, there in the clouds, or out there in the mysterious reaches of the universe. God is here. Jesus said, in the messiness and ambiguity of human life, God is here. Particularly in your neighbor, the one who needs you. You want to see the face of God? Buchanan asks. Look into the face of one of the least of these, the vulnerable, the weak, the children. There, right there, is the surprising element of this parable. Because when this parable was spoken, it was assumed that God was some deity way far off in a corner of the universe. It would have been profoundly baffling to hear it implied that God is right here with us, in the messiness and in the brokenness of this world. And it would have been surprising to hear that God cares deeply about those who are hurting and in pain. The poor, the hungry, the sick, the imprisoned. It was surprising then, and frankly, it's surprising now. We still get wrapped up in this notion that God is somewhere else, set apart, distant, removed from our everyday lives. That God only cares about those huge matters of the cosmos, but the poor, the sick. When you think about it, isn't it a little shocking that God, the creator of the universe, expresses a heart for those who are hurting, the downtrodden of the world, the ones who have fallen victim to injustice? That God not only makes the time to care for these, but that God chooses to identify with these. When I was hungry, when I was a stranger, when I was imprisoned, God says. Just 2 days after Jesus told this parable, he was handed over to be crucified. We turn the page and we find Jesus imprisoned and hungry, thirsty and sick, made a stranger to the world when his disciples abandoned him. The ultimate example of what it means to be the least of these. In that bold gesture, God declares once and for all that God is in complete solidarity with those who are hurting, with those who have been hurt. The events of Good Friday, which we remember next week, point us to this memory of Christ on the cross in a most vulnerable state, declaring that those who have suffered are not alone. God knows that suffering firsthand. In this bold parable, God declares this grand love for the least of these and invites Christ's disciples to love them as well, reminding them and reminding us to care for the least of these. Those who are hungry, those who are thirsty, those who are strangers in this land, those who are naked those who are sick, those who are in prison. The Presbyterian Mission Agency is launching an initiative called the Matthew 25 Church. They cite this text that we read today as a call to actively engage in the world around us, to act boldly and compassionately to serve the least of these. Our denomination is pointing out Christ's urgent call to be a church of action, where God's love and justice and mercy shine forth and are contagious. What a beautiful rallying cry for church. What a way to respond to the brokenness of our society, the decline of goodness in our world. Perhaps the answer to all the world's problems is to remember that God's heart is so big. God's compassion is so great that God's love envelops each and every one of us, especially those who are overlooked by the rest of the world. May our lives and our actions reflect that great love, seeking out how we too can care for the least of these. Amen.
Amen.
Our hymn of reflection this morning is "Today We Are Called to Be Disciples."